was a soldier in the Vietnam War. Had to attack, so I walked through the door of a building where the enemy was hiding upstairs. I wanted to take my gun, but they were already there. Shot me once, I fell through the floor. I realized this was I had been waiting for all my life. Death has come to.
The Vietnam War was a long, costly armed conflict that ended with the withdrawal of U.S. forces in 1973. With the North Vietnam being communistic, the U.S. had no choice but to join into the war. President Kennedy was a believer in the domino theory. The domino theory was a belief that communism would spread to neighboring countries. The Bay of Pigs invasion and the building of the Berlin Wall were two Cold War disasters that happened in the beginning of Kennedy's presidency. That encouraged him to increase his involvement in the war. Kennedy hoped that aiding the South Vietnam would redeem himself from the disasters. An incident that made the U.S. join in the war was the Gulf of Tonkin. In the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the USS Maddox, a Navy destroyer, had been attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats off the North Vietnamese coast. The Tonkin Gulf was approved by Congress on August 7th. The resolution enabled the President to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against forces of the United States. Because of this, Johnson and his advisors now had authority to expand the war. The day of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It was a very nerve-wracking experience, and I was one of only a few survivors. Some of my closest friends were killed in the explosion. It was one of the scariest things that had ever happened to me in my life. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. had to institute a draft because of the low amount of troops available. During the draft in the Vietnam War, men had to register within 30 days of their 18th birthday. The draft is used when American troops are in low supply. If your name was called, you had to report to the local draft board. Once at the draft board, community members would evaluate your draft status. The U.S. military ended up drafting 2.2 million American men out of 27 million.
Hey, Ma. Home from school. Ma? Oh, what's wrong?
Here.
Oh. Been drafted?
I was drafted on February 15th, 1970. It was my 22nd birthday. I was very excited to be able to serve my country, but also very nervous of the risks involved.
On the morning of March 16, 1968, Lieutenant William Calley Jr. led his platoon into the hamlet of My Lai, searching for any Viet Cong. The Viet Cong had been active in the area of My Lai, killing or wounding many American troops, then quickly disappearing. The platoon found men, women, and children in the village, but not any Viet Cong. Calley ordered his troops to kill many of the people in the village, including women and children, before burning it to the ground. Calley had been taught to suspect any Vietnamese as a potential enemy. Calley stated that they were there to kill ideology. The American troops were unsuccessful in finding any Viet Cong troops in My Lai. The massacre was hidden from the public before they revealed it. Almost all countries and the United States itself looked down upon the massacre. Just like the My Lai massacre was hidden, the government also hid something else. The government hid documents called the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were a collection of documents to trace the history of U.S. military involvement into Vietnam since the Truman years. They revealed the government officials had been misleading the American people about the war. When they were leaked, it angered President Nixon and it embarrassed government officials. Lawyers failed to persuade the U.S. Supreme Court to suppress their publication. On January 31, 1968, the North Vietnam launched a Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a coordinated series of fierce attacks on more than 100 cities in South Vietnam. It was planned by General Vo Gian Giap. It was planned in an attempt to cut down rebellion of the South Vietnamese population and encourage the United States to scale back its support of the Saigon regime. There was around 70,000 North Vietnamese communist troops that attacked in the Tet Offensive. Although the North Vietnamese suffered many losses, they won a strategic victory. The Tet Offensive got its name by a Vietnamese holiday. Tet on the Vietnamese calendar was a celebration of the Lunar New Year. But because of General Vo Gian Giap, the coordinated offensive was launched on January 31st. It then became known as the Tet Offensive. Throughout the Vietnam War, many lives were lost in both ground and aerial war. 3 million people, including 58,000 Americans, were killed. More than half of the deaths were Vietnamese civilians. More than 500,000 American military personnel were involved in the Vietnam War. With Viet Cong in the South, President Kennedy set up American military, economic, and technical aid in South Vietnam. Military bases were also set up in South Vietnam. With the military bases being in South Vietnam, the United States were able to get involved in air combat. The United States had favor over the air wars in Vietnam. America's Air Force greatly overpowered North Vietnamese Air Force. America's air power had around 3 bases in Vietnam. The U.S. launched small aerial raids on North Vietnam that almost always resulted in civilian deaths. Because of that, the North built thousands of small air raid shelters for civilians. America's primary target with air was the cities of Hanoi and Haiphong. Both cities were heavily defended. B-52 planes were mostly safe, but lower flying planes were less safe. Between 1965 and 1968, over 1,400 U.S. were shot down over North Vietnam. The North Vietnamese had Russian-supplied MiG-17 and MiG-21 PF fighters. Most of the damage was done by the North.
I can remember flying the B-52 plane just like it was yesterday. Although we all thought we were safe at such a high altitude, we all had a little bit of fear of us being shot down. Although nobody said it out loud, that's what we were all thinking.
The Vietnam War caused major social issues for American society. President Nixon wanted to put a stop to the war, so he created the policy of Vietnamization. Vietnamization was used by Nixon when he decided to transfer all military responsibilities to South Vietnam. Nixon believed that building up South Vietnam's military would help them prepare for a communistic takeover and help America withdraw from the war with their honor intact. The Tet Offensive was a major turning point in the Vietnam War. After the Tet Offensive, the 3-year aerial bombing against North Vietnam was halted. After they were halted, peace talks began in Paris while Nixon carried out Vietnamization to steadily reduce the number of U.S. combat troops in Vietnam. Although the U.S. was slowly leaving the war, they supplied South Vietnam with $965 million, which was originally supposed to be $2.2 billion. The Paris Peace Accords, or PPAs, were signed in January 1973 and restored peace and ended direct U.S. military involvement in Vietnam.
I was a soldier in the Vietnam War. Had to attack, so I walked